Hello, hello. Today we continue Economics 101. We're gonna go again with the history or continue history or growth of systems of economics, right? Or whatever people think economics is, it's actually a system which works together with a bigger structures in place. In this particular case, I'm going to talk about growth of economics and governance or politics, whatever you want to call it. I would call it governance because that's pretty much an ability of a smaller group of people. You're going to call it elite royals, you're going to call it whatever, presidents, cabinets, you name it, right? Trying to control economics, trying to control those systems. Why that exactly that happened, right? Because in the longest period of time, the land, and it's still a case, was controlled by a group of people. You can call them warlords, a smaller group of people. You can call them tribe leadership, army guys. You can call it whatever you want. It is what it is. And so they controlled the land. They controlled the people living there, who moved in, who moved out. The reason for this is to create a protection, right? Nothing less, nothing more. They created less risk for people living with that domain, and that's why those people were willing. Maybe originally there was more benefits, and then the war chief son decided that he's going to be ruthless and tax everybody more than he should, and basically support the army. Why exactly? Why exactly he would tax people? Because he needed value. He wanted to put his life in risk or manage the people, and he would need to do this, spend his time rather than doing other things, and he needed to get the value out of people to continue living, to support his living. And so that system came in place. And it grew because bigger systems were more stable and more profitable, which made them intrinsically more interesting. As one village organized into two, and then in three, and there was a region, and there were bigger, badasser warlords with a bigger, badasser army. There was, of course, a balance because you can tax the poor for so much until they actually gonna revolt or just die out of hunger, and then you won't have those people giving you money. And so evolutionary only smart warlords would survive because in a longer period of time they would have they would balance system out to make sure that it it's sustainable enough. Of course, there were other people coming in trying to take the value because it was the cheapest way to get rich. Why people went to wars? As I said, it was the cheapest way to get rich. There was no casinos, there was no lottery tickets. There were, hey guys, there was an army guys that were supported. They were bored or whatever, or it doesn't have to be even the army guys. You can say to your common villagers, hey, what if we just all go and rob other village and just take everything they have, and now we double our value? Think about it. That's a cool idea. That's that's a first schema of getting rich fast, which actually worked. Of course, of course, there is a risk connected to it, right? But at least that was an idea, and so that's why there were wars, because people wanted to take the value of others without others allowing this to happen. Another thing which happened is that the politician at that time, the royalties, whatever, they tried to get more richer than less. Of course, with a bigger scale, you can see that the value they would the value of their lands, right? The value of their corporation, the kingdom would produce would be higher than the val that than what they need needed for survival. They start going into luxuries, right? They will start creating new groups of people who were royalties. How exactly the royalties came to be? They were rich merchants, rich craftsmen, or rich, basically business owners. They had they still had they were like basically a rich management, and they would talk to the king saying, "Hey," for example, a king say, "I want to have." I don't know. I want to have a guest house, and it should have a lot of gold. And the guy who was like representative of gold artisans said, "Yeah, but now we actually want to own that land." And King was like, "I'm not really a fan of that." They would be like, "Yeah, but then you will need to pay us this amount of gold. But if you give us land, it would be twice cheaper. I give you 50% discount. Why do you care about that part of land? Nobody cares about it. You're not making any profit out of it because we're not like, I'm gonna use it for farm, right? I'm gonna use my money to start farming business, right, or something like this, or mining business, whatever you want to call it, right? And so that's how the exchange when happened, and that's where the land came into be as a part of a value exchange, right? It was always a value exchange, but it wasn't quantifiable. As soon as you start pegging things to gold, as soon as there were luxuries and elites, they start what else they could sell because they owned the land in a way they could actually send the plots of land. That's where the land ownership comes into place. That's why America was basically a biggest value transfer, because what had happened was, you had a huge amount of land for free, effectively for free, judging the markets of that age. And so exactly how politics was trying to change things around is trying to maximize their own egoistical profits. They're trying to get more value than they were deserving. And usually, what exactly it would cost, at minimum, it would cost revolt, right? At maximum, it would cost starvation. And if it would cost starvation, and for example, the king decided, okay, I'm gonna cut down the budget of military, right? Then what happened would the military would revolt and just kill the king. So now you see how those like natural checks and balances would be set in place, because now you see at different levels of groups which are interested in economics or in the system working perfectly, and as soon as it's getting affected, as soon as they're losing money, as soon as you push too much on them, they're pushing back, and they have a mechanism to to adjust the system. They have a mechanism to make sure that there are consequences for the specific messing around with the monetary policy. Because, for example, the king would try to, at that point, traveling with the gold, making sure it's enough weight and it's pure, whatever, became a problem, and so the kings start actually printing their own coins, and with that, we see a monetary policy coming to place. Why exactly they were printing their own coins? To create a security. Why create a security? Because now they were responsible for quality of those coins. They were responsible that those coins had a specific value in weight, and they would be freely exchanged within the kingdom of that country. And if anything, they could be melted back to different coins, and you can melt them into whatever the jewelry, right? You can do a lot of things, and you can melt the jewelry to actually make coins, right? So it was pretty good value, and that was another thing the government started providing. Why it wasn't done, why everybody didn't melt the coins? The reason is to not create the trust. And so now we're talking about building the trust, right? What exactly building the trust means? Not always you could have enough value in corporations to do an equal exchange, right? For example, you're growing crops. They're linked to the time cycle. but you don't have money right now. For example, you need blacksmiths to build you enough equipment to be effective on the field. And if you're effective on the field, that's going to yield more of the crops, which means that you're going to be profitable. But you need them right now in the spring, and you will have the crops to sell in the fall. You say yes, but why didn't you like collect enough in the beginning? That's an interesting idea. But what, let's say a year ago you had one field and now you have two fields, or now you have three fields. Now you need more stuff than you actually have in bank. And we go into idea of futures or obligations. Basically, people have an IOUs which are allowing you to say, okay, you give me this amount of things today, and I'm gonna give you this amount of other things or gold in the fall, right? And so now you create a risk situation. Of course, the rate would be different than if you would do it right now. It would be more beneficial for the one who is selling the goods right now, which would be a blacksmith, right? But he would now take a risk, right, of you actually defaulting on your obligations. Let's say you had three fields, but now storm hit, killed the crops, and you lost almost everything. You only got 10% of profits of what you planned to have. And now, not even you don't have enough to cover your expenses. You like your living, right, or living of your workers. You don't have enough to pay out IOUs. And so we're talking about actually now credit lines, because now the people would go into debts and there would be a negative balance, where before you can only have equal exchange for a time being, but now you have a risk and going negative. And those things would be controlled a lot of times by the royalties. There would be a trust protection, or the banks later on. There would be a trust protection. The idea that there are more stable banks, which has a bigger budget, which has a smarter people managing whatever budget they have. And they would through time build a trust. So their IOUs would be in a way better value, right, than IOUs of a new bank or new whatever. And that meant that the system benefited long-term goaling and long-term planning, and benefited better management, and benefited people who were sometimes just more lucky. That's what it is. Sometimes you're just lucky. What happened when the kings decided to change that? When they decided to take over the gold, usually the countries would go bankrupt. And what meant the countries go bankrupt? They would start wars, because now the king would say, he would never blame this, right, himself, but he he would spend too much money on luxuries, on other things. And elites, for example, at that time were spending too much luxuries, depending how much they gathered the risk of things. And then the natural thing would happen. I don't know, a huge flood, or like a natural disaster, which would affect everybody equally. Like, let's say there was a hailstorm, it destroyed a lot of crops, it destroyed a lot of properties, roofs, it started fires, some things burned out, a huge town burned out. All of those people becoming bankrupt, they becoming effectively homeless. And what else they can do? There's two opportunities that each dad in the household say, okay, I have we can just die, or we can start robbing things. And the governor at that place thinks like this: okay, we're gonna have right now people killing each other, basically a civil war kind of thing. And they can make over to our place, because they'll be like, oh, those riches, they have money, they have gold, they have food, we can steal from them. To prevent them effectively revolting, they would say, yeah, let's go to war, let's just attack our neighbor, and take all of their stuff. Everybody get rich. Nobody kills each other. You don't gonna come and threaten me. And let's do the whole thing, right? And so at some point, you can start seeing a need for global economy, a need of one bigger country giving IOUs to other countries to cover up, to create a security, to create an insurance, and to create an economic growth opportunity for smaller countries, right? You can see that there become an institution which at some point were bigger than the countries, like bank systems, which were owning so much money they could effectively bankrupt one place or another. Beside that, because all of the idea of those people is managing value, a lot of the banks started to invest in wars. For example, some wars didn't happen because banks deemed them too risky to invest. And you say, wait a second. Now you're talking about that you just jumped over the hoops. You just jumped so much into idea that evil banks with evil people working in them, deciding, like forcing the wars, right? Like making the wars happen. Yeah, but that's exactly how it happened. Sometimes king would decide, I want to get rich, right? I'm not getting credit line because my whatever, the prosper sucks. I just want to get rich. He had a huge army. The army guys wanted to get rich too. And he would say, okay, I'm going to go into neighbor. I'm going to steal all of their gold. Their approximate value is whatever, 20 million of gold. And then I'm going to, but I need right now spend money on powder buying from other neighbor, right? Or like buying iron ore from somebody else, and paying all of the artisans, all of the blacksmiths to actually build me enough weapons so I can succeed in this. And now you're talking about enterprise, right? Now you're talking about that there is like an idea of people investing, because you don't think about it. The actual war is very economically, even that it sounds lucrative, it's incredible risk, because you need to supply food. Those people who are in war, they're not doing anything productive. They're not producing any value. They're doing just a forceful transfer of value. And they need to be paid, they need to be supported, they need to be not hungry, because they're gonna just kill the general. If they're hungry, they're gonna kill everything around them until they're not hungry, right? If you think about this, and so it was a lucrative business, and so then the warlords would come to the banks to actually ask for a loan, because they, in the future, they would win the war and get those 20 million of gold to pay back, and so now they have a credit line. And because banks are smart, all they do is actually trading risks. Their business is not business of money, how you think about them. Their business is business of exchange of a risk. They trade one risk for another. That's pretty much what it is. And they try not to over leverage themselves between risks, so they will not bankrupt. And then they will be, then be a huge wall of trouble. Specifically when banks were managed terribly, and that happened so many times. You just don't know the history. Those banks all disappeared, but banks default a lot, and they bankrupt a lot, because they create too many IOUs. They cannot keep the books correctly. They don't count them correctly. They go in too much of a risk, and that risk doesn't pan out, and they lose, right, in the bigger scheme of things. And then the people comes in for to take their money, but all they have a paper. So now that bank is going bust, right? And that happened a lot of times. um, I hope it sort of makes sense for you to see how the system evolves into more complex and more global phenomena, and a lot of those principles guiding the decisions are purely economical, and they're purely always connected. Like they're just, if you look close enough, they're becoming more and more complex, because now trigger and the consequences are sort of they're disconnected in place. And as those systems becomes more complex, it's harder and harder for common folk to actually understand how they work, because they don't understand the sequence of events and the consequences of those events and how they happen on a higher scale and then trickle down to the lower scale where the average folk exists, right? And what other systems were done in place to ensure that there is a stability and there is, trading of resources, and there's a better opportunities for those resources. And so we will talk probably about cities, and the cities. The reason why the cities are important is basically they were first proto countries, proto sort of governed by economics countries. Because if you think about it, the royalties were more of corporations, right? They were large corporations when the system inside was a lot of times manually adjusted by the king, messed around, and if he was smart enough, he would succeed, but a lot of times he wasn't. He wasn't good enough to understand it, and so that's why there were a lot of wars, because wars for their primitive thinking were like, I take what you own and I'm becoming rich. Like that was the idea, and that's why in the Middle Ages the wars were so prevalent, because there were no better system in places which were more stable and would actually support better economic growth. Only with autonomy of the cities and the start of smaller countries, or the countries governed by economic systems, you would see those things evolving into more stable and more, not more profitable, but more sustainable systems of governance plus economics that would survive bigger problems, right? And that's where you can talk about Switzerland, who actually use economics to defend itself, right? Which now talks about, think about how powerful economics become, right? And then talk about, for example, banks, right? And whoever controls the banks controls the supply lines of the war. Now you're seeing that those places, those systems gaining more power than power of a king over his subordinates, right? And we're talking about now like 17th, 18th, 19th century, where it became obvious that that those systems on its own are more powerful, and the country started organizing around them, and they're becoming way more profitable and could defend themselves. There were still wars. They become less and less prevalent, and now the wars started to have a different character of actually controlling the systems. Now the systems actually were trying, by defense themselves, they were forcing the hand of warlords to risk their lives to ensure that the system was stable enough and the supply lines were unlocked. Your example, right, would be Iran supported militia in Sudan, I think, or I don't remember exactly like where it happened, but basically they were started attacking the transport in Mediterranean Sea, and that meant that it would affect supply lines. And soon as that happened, the correct response would be flood the whole area with warships and completely destroy all of those, like pirating and all of this stuff. And that's still happening, for example, in Caribbean and like South African areas where there are still pirates, and that creates a lot of risks. By risk, it creates it creates push for raising the cost of supply, because that's what it is. Because now you need to pay for higher insurance for that part, and we're gonna talk about insurance probably in the next series, because it's still as system getting more complex. We will start branching out into now subgroups of one system, when in the kingdom the system was pretty straightforward. Even with that, now you can see that the kingdom had artisan, it had miners, it had farmers, it had merchants, it had army guy, it had banks, it had all of those stuff becoming more and more of a different sub-economics, or like sub parts of a system, and there were more and more professions ensuring that there is a better and more secure exchange of value. And and that's where we bring with probably crypto. I think crypto is undervalued from that perspective, but the reason crypto is not adopted is because it actually requires too of a high of a ceiling for a knowledge of how to operate with it, and then the countries are actually consider crypto a threat because it's a monetary policy they cannot control. And so we're going to talk about that way later to try to explain the current state of economics and why there are a lot of problems which we see, and that's why we see an inflation, and there's going to be a correction for that inflation. Just a spoiler alert, and no worries. No worries, that's going to come, but I'm going to explain how we got to this, because we didn't get to this by kings deciding. We got to this by democracy deciding, by people deciding, and there is a responsibility. Of course, there are malicious actors, but we're gonna talk about later on how that's not always the best scenario, and that's not always a good answer. Okay. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Share and subscribe. Yeah. Ask more questions. Yeah. Have a good one.